Hello, 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 good people on the internet. Welcome to the final January live stream.
Crazy.
Good things come to those who wait. And if you guys were under the impression that all the hard work you've been doing editing your book will go in vain, think again. We here at Manuscripts not only talk the talk, but we walk the walk. We are published authors after all, and we are equipped with knowledge on how to get published, and we are keen on sharing the info with you for free. So you can make an educated decision about how to publish your book once you feel you're ready to make that step. And all of this info is coming in February, so buckle up. But before we do that, we need to send January and editing on its merry way. And today, I will be your host. Your favorite host, Stephen Howard, is vocally indisposed. He spent the weekend singing Total Eclipse of the Heart at his local karaoke bar, so he will hang out with us in the chat. Hi, Stephen. I'm having way too much fun making stuff up, creating your reputation, so we should do this more often. No, this is Steven's world and we're just living in it. But it is a good reminder that the chat is open for questions. So if you guys have any questions, we will address them during the live stream. And now, without further ado, let's get down to business. So we have talked about developmental editing, revising, character arcs, plot holes, and now it's time to talk about how to actually apply all of our previous tips and put them to good use. So, assisting me in this endeavor tonight is my co host, a published author, an incredible writer, and an author coach, Vincent. Hi, Vinny. How are you?
Hey, Zara. Pretty good. After you hyping me up, it raises the spirits a little bit. End of January. I'm excited. Having a good night.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah.
here for. That's what I'm here for. Awesome. So, our special guest of honor, it is my pleasure to welcome Cory Frankiel. Hi, Cory.
Hello.
Hi.
Vince is right.
So,
That does feel
Cory,
good.
I know, right? Hyping you up. Well, in case you guys haven't heard of this incredible guy, you will. But let me just give you a quick introduction. Corey graduated from University with a BA in English, so he's a specialist in the written word and spoken word. He has been pursuing a childhood dream of writing a fantasy book for as long as he can remember. Fantasy was his escape as a child, as he told me, always at the back of his mind. And his ultimate goal is to write stories for video games and narrative design. So, Corey, welcome again. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.
Uh,
So, Corey, you are on the track to publish this year with New Degree Press your book, The Elegy for the Living. Very compelling title, by the way. Is a fantasy, from what I understand. So, why don't you tell us more about it? What are you exploring in this book?
um, well, I've I'm exploring. I'm trying to put sort of normal fantasy tropes into more modern contexts, and then revisit them within those modern contexts. So there's all these. There are many fantasy tropes about the two I use are paladins and necromancers, which are things that if you're familiar with fantasy or Dungeons and Dragons, those you have an instant association with those two things. In my book, I've uh, those two specific things, paladins and necromancers, are now, instead of just being sort of like classes in a video game or classes in Dungeons and Dragons, they're socioeconomic classes. Those are groups of people that live in a city, and they're different cultural groups, and they have different traditions and different values and different the things that they do every single day. Everything's different, and I wanted to put those things into a more modern context. So, like, what happens if people who can talk to the dead have to drive to work and then have to go on the subway, or like, how do they go about their daily lives? What is important to them? And I flipped it on its head a little bit. Usually the paladins are the good guys and the necromancers are the bad guys, but that seemed it's too simple. It's too didactic for me. So I wanted to make it more a story of like approaching prejudices and fighting prejudices. So the story is actually, so that's the world. The story is about a young man, an adult, Dante, who he's a necromancer. He's not doing so great when we meet him. He's living on the street. He hasn't been
any
able
relation to Dante's Inferno? Are you pulling from that or not at all?
I'm leaning on some. I mean, there's some very heavy-handed imagery, if I'm being totally honest.
Right.
But,
well, it's a heavy-handed topic, talking about prejudice, so it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So Dante's Inferno evokes images of the dead already when you're listening,
right?
When you're reading. The other protagonist is a paladin. Her name is Angela. She is sort of the see angels, Dante, devils, sort of.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Juxtaposition, love it.
Yeah, exactly. She is sort of a new cop on the force in the paladin equivalent of a police force. They're called knights, and a lot of times throughout, and many years ago, there was a war, and so there's a lot of hatred between the two groups. And the story is about Dante, who has become disillusioned with being a necromancer and all of the things that come with his culture, and he none of it makes sense to him. None of it's important to him. He tries to fight against the oppression that he feels, and in doing so, he sort of learns a lesson about what it means to see eye to eye with the other side and to talk with people who are very, very different from you. And Angela learns the same thing. She learns to get over the preconceived notions. They meet and they go on a little adventure. And she learns what it means to overcome the hatreds that she's been taught, that have been instilled in her since she was young, because those hatreds are artificial. They're taught. They're not natural. They don't.
Yeah,
there's no reason for them to exist.
Absolutely.
And I really wanted to explore that little
wow
thing.
Necromancy, disgusting. I love it.
Vinny, some gross parts.
Vinny, what's your experience with prejudice in literature? Except for the obvious. Prejudice, yeah.
Wow. So basically, you're saying this and I'm thinking about historical fiction, as I always do, because I can't break outside of my bubble ever. But prejudice is a tough topic to handle. So I do think about some of the topics that I had to explore with my book, with prejudice against Native Americans and that kind of stuff. But I feel like there's no one book that's going to completely tackle it as a topic. So I am curious, Cory, in how heavy-handed and how far did you feel you wanted to go? Was there a point where you're like, you know what, I'm really going to focus more on the story in this moment and less on the themes? Or was it like, no, I have a really clear thing that I want to make this story about and a clear theme that I'm going to deliver at all costs? Like sort of like what came foremost in your mind as you were writing the book? Or was
chicken or egg, basically?
Chicken or egg? Oh,
is what he's asking.
That's a very important question, because it's something that I had to ask myself many times while I was writing, and now as I'm revising. Like, I initially, I think I wanted to put the story first, but that was before I really knew what the story was and what it would become. Because the story changed a lot from when I first thought of the basic outline of the plot to where it is now.
As it does.
Sorry?
As it does.
Yeah, as it does, exactly. And while it might have started as just sort of like a fantasy adventure, If I'm being completely honest, a lot of what spurred me in the direction that I went with the book were different things that happened in America, like real world events happened that sort of brought my attention to horrible injustices that occur in society every single day. Something that sort of gets directly addressed a lot in the book is police brutality. And I mean, just the last 2 years, as I was writing the book, police brutality was a topic that came up, unfortunately, many times. And
so it's very current, very topical. That's how you make fantasy more relatable.
And that's
current.
That's what I was going to say next. Is that why fantasy? Well, fantasy allows us to approach topics that are uncomfortable to us without with this barrier of
mental barrier
between it.
Right.
Exactly. And the barrier, it's a window. It's not a wall. It allows you to see and examine the issue while not forcing you to go out and touch it.
Right.
And so if you want to examine prejudice and police brutality and injustice like that, social injustice, then fantasy is an excellent way to do it. And as I was writing the story, I found that there were many moments where the story, my thinking about the story became very practical. Like, what needs to happen next? What needs to happen next? What needs to happen next? And the things that I was thinking about more and more, that I was really devoting a lot of my mental energy to, were the how am I expressing these themes? How do the cultural values of these two different groups, how do they come out throughout the book? And that's what I gave a lot of thought to. And I think that's one of the things I'm hoping to fix in my revision, is I'm trying to go back to the places where I feel as though the story might have gotten glossed over, and, give it a fresh coat of paint, and hopefully make it enhance the themes as opposed to have to contend with them, or not contend, compete with them.
Right. What really drew me to this was the title, obviously. So how did you come up with that, the Elegy for the Living?
Well, I came up with it out of necessity. I had a working title that I'm not going to say what it was, because I just hated it and I hate bringing it up. But I had a working title. And it's possible that you might be able to find it somewhere online, that I forgot to change it. But I had a working title.
I won't if you ask me not to. It's okay.
Don't look for it. It's not worth it.
All
right. And I do that a lot. I give things names when I'm not going to bother with a name right now. I'm just going to give it. This chapter is called Kidnapped, because the guy gets kidnapped. Great, perfect. Send it.
Right.
The process for coming up with a title. So this was one of the moments where I had to think about both the things that were happening thematically in the book, as well as the content of the story, and try to bring them together. Right. And I think it does a good job in a few different ways. It expresses one of the primary themes of the book, one of the primary motifs of the book, rather, which is death and coping with death. And like what is an elegy? An elegy is the living's reaction to death, and how they perceive it, understand it, and how it affects them. And it's mournful, it's sorrow, it has sorrow. And an elegy for the living, the reason it's compelling is because it's a little bit paradoxical. And it's putting
total oxymoron. That's
right. And it implies that the living are in some way dead.
Right.
And
gosh, that's dark.
Yeah, it is a little bit dark. But like, why would you write an elegy for the living? You would write it because there's something that has disappeared, or something that is gone and dead in the people that you are surrounded by, that needs to change. And one of the most dramatic ways to display that would be to create something that shows how the status quo is wrong, corrupted, decayed, the opposite of life.
Right.
And I honestly, when I was working on a new title, I wrote a list of as many words as I could think of that were related to the themes of my book. And I'm a little bit of a poetry nerd, so I wanted to incorporate some poetic thing in there.
It is very poetic. Yes, that's what I was gonna say. It sounds very
And
poetic.
yeah,
Definitely.
and I so like elegy, ode. I mean, there are other things, but they wouldn't make good titles. But
Right.
that and I eventually landed on this because, you know, it caught my eye. It was like, that one's definitely the strongest one I've come up with.
It is.
I really
It
like
is.
that.
It is for sure. Vinny, what's your take on death in literature? Do you think that it's often portrayed too heavy-handedly, like too on the nose, or more like metaphorically? Or what do you like most when it's more in terms of metaphors or yeah?
Yeah,
Let's hear it.
that's crazy because I think like prejudice, like all these other really difficult themes to tackle in fiction, that's something that's totally case by case. And I've never really noticed like a clear trend. But something that's beautiful about revisions in that, Cory, as you're talking, like I'm hearing it and kind of realizing, like you're saying, polishing things up. You have these big themes that you're tackling, then and you have the earlier phases of development where you're really building a structure of the book that is like best suited to tell a story that tackles that and explores it in a really meaningful way. And like you can hear it and you talking about it, that's something you want served by your book. You want your book to serve that purpose. And so the nice thing about revisions is you're coming back and you're looking at each little piece of all that coming together and you're polishing it, so to speak, in a way that it actually really does hammer home that message, whether it be something that's poignant about death, which, you know, if you're gonna really tackle death, you want it to be poignant. You know, if you're gonna tackle prejudice as a topic, you want it to be poignant. You want to say something with it. And so it's really cool to have a long process where you can come back to what you've built and make it work even better every time. And so something that I'm wondering with you is are you really feeling that kind of like excitement as you're coming through and having each moment kind of say something with a little bit more punchy, like punchier every time? Or did you feel like when you built the structure that a lot of that was just inherent and it's more so revisions or more so just, you know, cleaning out a little bit of the mess and it's the punch is already there?
Right.
I think if I'm being completely honest, the way that I've imagined the book so far, it's got it. I would like there to be more moments that stand out as poignant statements on death and prejudice and all that and stuff like that. But now that I'm like thinking more about it, it flows in waves a little bit more, where yes, there are moments where everything that's happening isn't serving directly to those themes. And it would be difficult to create something where every single moment of the book is serving the themes and that is also thematically satisfying, or not thematically, narratively satisfying.
Yeah.
But there are moments of like, all right now, I'm clearly tackling prejudice, police brutality, those topics right here. And then as the characters exit from that situation, they need to, you know, like, okay, and now they're tackling death, and now they're talking about history and tradition and what it means to, you know, have family and stuff like that. And I think if I could punch up the moments that are already strong, and make sure that they really can hit home with all of my readers, I want to make sure that those moments are as solid as possible. I don't think that it would work for me to go in and try to put things where I didn't initially think they should belong. At least not like, that's not what I should be setting out to do. If
Yeah.
I realize that, oh, okay, here I can make another point about death or something, and then I can fit that in with a revision. That's great. But I don't know if I don't know if I could revamp such key areas like that yet.
Yeah.
Right.
It's great to hear you talking that way too, because I do think a lot of times that people can build this story and then in revisions add too much of that, and the story kind of crumbles under the weight of all that. And it's no longer a vehicle for even discussing those topics or even just telling a good story separate from any of them. So that is really fascinating to hear that, you're looking at different moments and saying like that moment needs to be the strongest, but I'm not just going to throw, darts at a board and try and have it say something when there's nothing to say in that moment. That's really cool.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it almost sounded like Cory had everything figured out. So I'm really glad to hear that sometimes he's as confused as everyone else.
Oh yeah.
So great combo. Yeah, great combo and great segue into your question, Cory. You posted a question for us coaches. So let's dive in. I can't wait to address this. So your first question is, let's see. How do you keep all the details straight when revising a story? There are so many things that I forget or contradict, and I find myself tripping over the knots that I've tied myself into. Vinny, you want to go first?
Yeah, you know what? Yes, I think I got this. It's one of those really loaded topics. Like the last question that you just asked, I'm like, oh, it's a case-by-case basis. Guess what? We're all case-by-case bases as authors. And some people are more the outlining types, very specifically written out every detail. I'm not as much like that. I definitely want some notes here and there to like in a rough structure to help me and guide me and come back to. But for me, I keep the narrative details straight by living and breathing the story as much as humanly possible. And I feel like that's kind of a cheap answer in a way because, I imagine every author's doing that. But I think as you're going through the book in some sort of method, maybe that's the key. Maybe there's some sort of order, whether it be you go back in chronological order and you go through and it helps you as almost like a reader re-see what details you're missing. And then also maybe like beta reader help is helpful for spotting a few of those details that don't make as much sense, so that some of it is stuff we can't really fill in as well, just with our own pair of eyes, and having editors or other eyes on it is helpful for that. But just on your own, it's really hard to just do that, perfectly. How do you feel about this one, Zara?
Right. My advice, honestly, you don't even have to write a fantasy story to get lost in your book. It's just what happens. My advice would be read your manuscript back to back in one go once you are finished with the first draft. And whilst you are reading it, all the pieces of the puzzle that don't quite fit in well rear its ugly head at you. So from that point on, it's just about organizing yourself. Start making notes on all those pieces that do not fit in and write down the chapter number and the problem in that chapter and start interconnecting it as you go forward. I guess so. Right.
Chapter number and problem. I guess like if you were editing a paper or something.
Yeah. I think that revisions it's a technical process, right? Your creativity has to kind of go take a back seat for a moment. And if you approach it academically, that can really help you stay organized. But definitely just read the thing first and then go in chapter by chapter and start making notes. Like the first chapter can make perfect sense, and then you read the second one right after that, and you're like, oh no. This doesn't correspond with what I wrote in the first chapter. You take a note, right? And that's how you go in, and you definitely need a system for that. And that really depends on you what kind of system you create, whether you want to track yourself digitally or in just a Word document. The system is really up to you, but you need to stay organized, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, another thing that Oh, go for it, Cory.
Have an organization step to every time I go in to revise something, every time I go in to look for mistakes, have an organization step where even if it isn't like a global issue, or it's like, even if it doesn't contradict something later in the book, like mark it, timestamp it essentially, but in your book. So it's not a timestamp. I guess it's a page stamp. Stamp it.
Awesome.
Okay, that could work. I could do that.
Awesome. Really good combo, guys. And right, let's dive into your second question, which is, I found that my writing style has phases. Sometimes I focus more on dialogue, sometimes description and action. How do I make sure that my style stays consistent? Well, I can start us off on this one. Um, so there should be a nice balance amongst all of those. Not necessarily in one chapter. It depends on the writing style. Like Mark Twain is all about action, Jane Austen is all about introspect. Those two effing hated each other's books, and the world loves them respectively. So I recently finished Stephen Howard's book, and the first half is all about action, and then the book slows down in the middle, which I think works really well. If you yourself as an author feel like your book needs to breathe, give it some much needed breathing space, or vice versa. The trick is to keep your fingers on the pulse of the book. If you feel like your book is putting you to sleep, then it's probably time to whip out some action scenes. Um, Being consistent means that you follow the pattern that you have created in your book. Fantasy genre exists within its own set of rules. Usually, the stories are slow paced because you are building a whole new world that readers need to get familiar with. You have Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, right? Slow build up, slow build up, slow build up, boom. Action sequence that takes your breath away at the end. Same goes for Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, right? The first 1,000 pages, they're just going on a tourist excursion across the Middle Earth, and we arrive at the heart of the true conflict at the very end. So there is a pattern in fantasy genre for sure, but I wouldn't say those patterns are set in stone. And the key to staying consistent is to find your pattern and stick with it, if that makes sense. Vinny, how do you feel about this one?
Yeah, I would second everything you said, but then add on top of that, when I was revising, it's very hard not to do the same thing that I did when I was writing, which usually when you're writing, you're focusing on that specific piece of dialogue or that specific chunk of description or action that you're working on. And it's sort of isolated, regardless of how it's connected in the book. You may have like a conscious awareness of how it's connected to the book. Like obviously, like you're writing it for a reason, but
Right.
you're really focused on making that part work. But then if you read it in the same way a reader would, sometimes, yeah, things can feel kind of chunky. It's like, oh, here's a dialogue bit. All right, then it sort of shifts voices a little bit because now we're in the action scene. All right, then some description. And it just feels like a bunch of separate pieces like put together weirdly. And I think how a book reads continuously could be terrible, even if all those distinct bits are actually really solid in and of themselves. So something that I think a lot about, or I thought a lot about in the revision step, was flowing each piece together. And I think if you're having trouble with having a consistent voice between all of them, really focus on where they transition. And that'll help you realize how difficult is it for me to move from this one dialogue sequence into the action. And if I'm finding it really hard to make that transition between the two, then maybe I can pinpoint all the ways the voices are different and focus on, okay, how can I strategically change the way I write my dialogue or the way I write my action so that it works with the dialogue or the action that's in the book. And actually having like flow. I mean, flow is such another term that just, oh, flow. But I think it's really important, especially for readers, because people read much quicker than you write.
Oh yeah, the pace of the story is incredibly important. How do you feel about the pacing of your story, Cory?
I think the pacing's okay. I think there are times when it doesn't necessarily uh, uh, slow down as much as it trips for a second and then it picks itself back up.
Okay.
Like where there's action, there's like a build up to action and then it'll like stop. And then
Right.
there's another build up to action. So, I mean, I guess it's not, tripping is kind of a mean way to put it, but I think it's more of, it's like a sudden short stop that
Okay. Like a
slowly builds back up.
cliffhanger or a
Yeah.
hook, or what would you call it?
Yeah, kind of like a hook. I don't know. It's transitions or big transitions.
Right.
But what I'm hearing is that I should probably read my book more times all the way through. I have to read my book? Come on.
Yes.
That's crazy.
I know, because every
Culture.
writer comes to a phase where they hate their book and their writing, and
I
you
don't want to read
cringe
that. That's
at
gross.
the thought. Right. And you cringe at the thought of reading it, but like that's the key. You have to read the whole thing in one go, especially if you go into revising, because you've been away from it. You don't remember every detail, even if you kept track of some of the things. You may have an overall picture in your mind and it can be fresh, but those little details can trip you up, right? So it's such a seemingly unimportant detail, but I feel like revisions kind of depend on it, on reading your manuscript back to back. What do you think, Minnie?
I totally agree. Or at least, even if you don't have a dedicated, like, oh, I read the entire thing back to back, you know, if you just decide not to do that, really learning the practice of reading like a reader for your own book, which is so hard to do. But I feel like now, once you move out of development and, you know, obviously the first draft and the drafting phase, it's time to like switch brains a little bit and read like a reader so that you can go back and write, you know, and edit certain parts.
Yeah.
Right. There is a comment, and it says, smooth transitions between action and slow points really help readers as they read through it. What do you think, Cory? Are you sticking to this rule? Do you have this in mind when you are writing?
I definitely have it in mind for, I think for the beginning of action scenes. I think I ramp up into action well. I think there are times though where I don't. I'm sort of thinking about specific instances now, and I think my solution for getting out of an action scene is cut. Next scene. We'll talk about what happened after that train flew by next time.
Right. So, like, that's not necessarily a bad tactic as long as there's a satisfying resolution to that somewhere at the as we read the book, because then it can be like a build up without the payoff, if that makes sense. So if you want to keep readers hooked, I think that's a good tactic, as long as you have this in mind that at some point you will have to bring this to a satisfying resolution. Vinny, your take?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because the way you're describing it to me, I'm picturing somebody like fishing and they're winding up little piece by piece, and it's sort of like a big action movement that ramps up the tension. And if you never satisfy that tension, or if you never subvert it successfully, dare I say, by the end of the book in some way, then the readers are going to feel sort of like you broke their trust by not resolving each of those action moments. So yeah, it's something definitely to think about if your book is accomplishing that by the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Well, Cory, do you have any more questions for us? Any final thoughts? How are you feeling?
So. I'm feeling good. It's
Yeah.
nice to talk about and be honest about the problems that I've been seeing over the revisions. Like,
Isn't it?
seeing them and then encountering them and having to face them is one thing, but like once you talk about it, it feels better. It's like, oh yeah, other people know about these problems too, and there are ways to fix them.
Right. Yeah. Vinny, final thoughts?
Final thoughts and sort of like a final question, totally out of left field, but I heard you want to get into game narrative design.
Yes.
And to me, it's fascinating because I think about all the complications of writing a story that can go in multiple places. And I just know some games have like divergent endings, and there's literally whole hours long chunks of the game that are different depending on what you do. Or there's some games where you do one detail and it subtly changes what's essentially the same scene. What fascinates you maybe more about the potential of doing that with a narrative? Do you like those big, like, diverging paths, or is it just cool minor detail differences?
So for me, what interests me from a creative standpoint is the impact I can have on a reader by giving them a choice. So for me, it's the choice itself that's interesting. The narrative possibilities, you're sort of giving them an option to be good or be evil, let's say, as an example. And the story panning out as a good person story or a bad person story, those are two interesting paths, I'm sure. But the fact that forcing the reader to contend with what they actually think about something, and then making a decision and shaping a narrative, it makes the storytelling process cooperative. And I like the idea of facilitating that cooperation, of giving the player, in this case, sort of a hand in crafting their story, their narrative experience. The twists and turns are that for them to create.
That's awesome.
Sort of.
That is awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys, for this amazing conversation. I've had a ton of fun with all of y'all, and I want to thank our viewers for joining us tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning of the live stream, we have lots of goodies coming up in February. In the meantime, before the first February live stream, join us for coffee chats, audience building live streams, and a special edition of a coffee chat happening tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. called Espresso Double Shot. We'll be talking about the cover design. And yeah, see you very soon. Thank you so much for joining us, Cory.
Thanks,
Thank you
Cory.
for having me.
Have a good one, guys. Bye bye.